So in this talk, I focus on how my work in anthropology and climate change came about and how that research trajectory has evolved to date. And I believe that this will inform our important work here at the AAS and also potentially be beneficial to the graduate students here. I also thought maybe someone out there will hire me to a post in Australia, considering the downward spiral of the United States administration. I use an inductive approach in my talk, taking you with me to witness the process of how my work came to focus on climate change, then to understand the multiple drivers challenging populations in the Anthropocene, and overall to forefront the need for effective interdisciplinarity. I first frame my work with two concepts. The first is bottom-up complexity, used by anthropologists and climate modelers alike. Two perspectives, two world views, call them Western science and local knowledge, that form a meeting place for interdisciplinary understanding. I work in the boundaries between these two worlds. I am in the bridged place between Western and local knowledge. The second concept is that of adaptive challenges. Herein, conventional thinking of adaptation expands to consider the complexity of the adaptive process, not as a simple technological or behavioral fix, but rather involving a deliberative and iterative process of negotiating ways of being within the context of ecosystem changes, interacting with socio-cultural perceptions, understandings, meanings, and beliefs. And then before launching into the ethnography, I will also give you a roadmap, a framework, a general sense of where I'm going with these three main points. First, that anthropology provides keen insights to how Vilui-Sakha and Labrador communities interact with and respond to the bottom-up complexities and adaptive challenges of change past and present. That collaborating with other affected communities in the investigation of bottom-up complexities clarifies culturally specific adaptive challenges and in turn informs research and local perceptions. And three, that anthropology contributes important insights and tools to discern bottom-up complexities and adaptive challenges and can make important contributions towards transformative interdisciplinary global change projects. So I've worked with the Vilui-Sakha communities of northeastern Siberia since 1991. They are a Turkic-speaking peoples whose, I'm going to use the pointer in this right-hand screen since it doesn't automatically go into the other one. So their ancestors, their Turkic ancestors, migrated from Central Asia across Russia to the Lake Baikal region around 900 AD. And then in the Genghis Khan period, they followed the Lena River north to these areas here, attracted to them because of their plentiful hayfields for their animals. They brought a horse and cattle breeding culture with them. Here you see a close-up of this large, what used to be an autonomous republic is now a republic within Russia. They inhabit an area with a relatively flat landscape, as you can see in the upper right, that is characterized with cryogenic lakes, basically lakes within the permafrost that are bordered by hayfields that transition to a boreal forest. And as you can see by the description here of the climate, they adapted this horse and cattle breeding subsistence to a very different and extreme climate, mostly by keeping their animals in barns in the winter and harvesting copious amounts of hay in the summer to feed them in the barn. They've gone through many changes. In the 1600s, Cossacks came through the Ural Mountains and basically took over the whole Asiatic area of Russia, claiming it for the Russian Empire, and demanded fur taxes from the local people. But I would argue that the largest change that they have encountered has been the Soviet period, where they were forced into larger and larger collectives and then finally state farm industries. The other big change, of course, in the Soviet period was the industrialization of the former Soviet Union. In this Viluy-Sahaz area, they discovered diamonds, and so diamond mining was the main industrial pursuit. And without any environmental controls, it wreaked havoc with Viluy-Sahaz water, land, and air. So my dissertation research in 1999 asked how Viluy-Sahaz had adapted to another huge change which happened when the Soviet Union fell in 1991. And I looked at this from a household food production level. And I found that the common denominator of high home food production was the presence of cows, and that cowless households realized high home food production by interdepending with kin households who had cows. And I called this adaptation cows and kin. And basing it in Robert Netting's cultural ecological theory, I came to the conclusion that they had adapted to the 1991 fall of the Soviet Union through fundamental cultural ecological ways by retrieving production knowledge, reviving ecological knowledge, and relying on kin. Towards the end of my research, though, I started hearing people talking about the need to get rid of the cows, to pave the streets, and I understood that with access to especially soap operas from around the world that presented the way to live as being wealthy and et cetera, as you know from all these great soap operas, that they were thinking this was what they needed to aspire to. And of course, I had just found out that they'd created this very sustainable, locally based food production system. And so I proposed and was funded for another 3-year NSF project, which specifically looked at how communities define sustainability. And we found through focus groups and interviews and surveys that they basically felt that these were the 4 foundational pieces of what they needed for a plentiful, abundant future. We didn't use the word sustainability because just like we have a hard time explaining what that is, they don't even have it in their vocabulary. But in the survey, the very last question of the survey, is there anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to tell me about? 90% of the responses to that question had something to do with the weather, the strange timing of the seasons, etc. And so we spent the last few weeks of that field season, of that last summer, interviewing elders. 33 elders, understanding that they had seen the most circles around the sun, they'd seen the most annual changes, and they could give us perhaps some insight to what these changes were that were of such concern to local people. And in amongst these 33 elders, 10 of them talked about how the bull of winter was not arriving anymore. So the bull of winter is Sahaz's mythological beast who arrives in about mid-December when the temperatures have gotten so cold and the climate is so dry that it stops snowing. And that kind of deep cold and dryness is held for about 3 months. And then, you know, spring has arrived when the snow starts to fall. And in the last 10 years, approximately, that pattern had been changing to the point where it did not stop snowing. They were having snow throughout the winter. And so this idea that this bull of winter would no longer be a way for them to explain the annual change, but rather something to talk about how it was, struck me as very meaningful and powerful, especially in anthropology, to understand the implications of that symbol changing and the cultural implications of climate change overall. So again, I proposed and was funded for a 3-year project to study specifically these changes. The community supported this idea very wholeheartedly, and through focus groups and interviews, we determined these were the 9 main changes that most people observed. And for the sake of time, I won't go into each one, but I will speak about the one that is most concerning for people, too much water on the land. So what is that about? Well, it's a complex process to explain to you what is happening, but the combination of the melting permafrost and the snow coming all summer, leading to larger than normal amounts of melting snow in the spring melt, leaves all this water on the land. But this is very concerning for people who depend upon the hay fields for the fodder for their animals. It also has implications for getting their other resources. For example, going out for the firewood that they need to get. You can see in the lower left-hand picture, even if there are dry fields in the middle of the fields, the areas to enter them and access them are often waterlogged. And then the picture on the right shows what happens as the water on the land increases and those circular ponds and lakes begin to also expand into the forest and killing the trees. So there are these, let's say, multiplying effects that occur. Another issue is for houses. The villages are either by a lake or by the river to get their water needs, and villages by lakes, because of the expanding lakes, the houses are rotting in their foundations, as you can see in the picture below. People are moving the houses back from the lake, all of this implying much more work for the people. And this is a Balouse, which is an underground freezer. So one of the adaptations to this extreme environment is to create a freezer by tunneling down to the permafrost, creating an area there in the temperate months of the year, putting everything that you need frozen down there. And as you can see in this picture, these are also flooding, so they're unusable. So lots of implications. One of the first questions we asked people was, have you seen this amount of water on the land before? Many people old enough to remember the flood of 1959 remember that flood, but also that it only lasted for several days and it was gone. That's the difference. Now the water is not going anywhere. So in further conversations with people, in conversations during the focus groups, we came to appreciate the fact that this increasing water on the land was also generating a lot of fear and concern. These pictures I took on the way to the field in 2008 after not being there for 3 summers when we were funded with this new climate project. And I took these pictures because I'd flown this pattern for almost 2 decades, and I noticed that there was a lot of water down there. Then we got to the villages and people started saying these kinds of things, as is in this quote here. So it's important to understand, and I did some work also. We asked questions in the survey about the beliefs. Saha, like many peoples across the world, have an animistic belief system, believing that all of nature, all parts of nature are sentient or spirit-filled, and water is included in that. So the 2009 survey that we used to understand the extent to which the broader communities agreed with what we had found from the qualitative interviews and focus group sessions. We asked about these changes. We asked about beliefs about water. We had several other sections. The final section was on climate change. And this is the first time that we actually used that terminology. And we found from that survey that all of the people who fulfilled the survey had heard of climate change. They'd known about it for 5 or 10 years. They'd heard about it on the radio, the television, and the newspaper. But they failed to make the connection of climate change with what they were observing, the water on the land and the other 8 changes that I listed. Another insightful part of this was how people explained the changes. We call them the explanatory stories. We found that the most popular explanation was the Viliui hydroelectric station reservoir. So I mentioned that diamonds were discovered in the Soviet period, and right away they built a huge hydro dam and flooded it in order to generate enough electricity to process the diamonds. It's a massive reservoir. It flooded hundreds of thousands of hectares of land. And so people explain that the huge surface area of that reservoir evaporates up into the sky, creates a cloud. The cloud comes over us. It keeps it warm in the winter and cool in the summer. It's a pretty good estimation of what's going on, but it's not accurate. There's been studies showing that the reservoir only has a microclimatic effect. They're probably 100 kilometers from this site, if not more. And again, here's a picture of that diamond mine I spoke of before. And just to give you a perspective, this is the city of Mirny, close to the edge. The second most popular explanation was wet years, dry years. So like most people adapting and living in an ecosystem, they understand that precipitation fluctuates from year to year. There's a range of precipitation, and so they've adapted to that wet year, dry year cycle that they have in their ecosystem. The problem with this explanation is that it's been wet far too long. The third most popular explanation was too much technica. Basically, we're talking about a lot of people who grew up with little or no mechanization in their lives, and so over the course of their lives, they've seen this huge change. And they're also very strong observers of the sky in the daytime and the night, so seeing all of the little lights going across the sky as they're observing the stars, seeing the planes, etc., during the daytime. This is their idea of why these changes are occurring. And I guess if you think about it, they're not completely wrong, right? And then global climate change was the least mentioned explanatory story. And people who mentioned it were either geography teachers in the village schools or elders who read every newspaper they could subscribe to in these distant villages. So this alerted us to the fact that there was not much contextualized information about climate change in terms of being able to relate what they're observing. And of course, it's not all climate change, but it definitely is having a strong effect in their ecosystem. And that we knew they were very knowledgeable about the landscape. They're seeing these kinds of changes. This is an ice wedge coming up, pushing up through the permafrost, and then the land sinking in front. They go to feed the spirits, the ancestral spirits, at their ancestral homesteads once or twice a year, and so they know this land and they observe changes. We also know that there is some reference to this change in their ancient philosophy. And we also know that there is some coverage of it in the regional and republic-wide newspapers. However, this is all about the more extreme events that are occurring in the northern part of the republic. And lastly, the other piece of information, if you want to call it that, that they were getting was this this sensational documentary, not documentary, anyway, whatever it was. It's still out there somewhere. But when it first came out, it was shown quite frequently during prime time. So our idea, how can we bring this understanding of this global change into the local vernacular, their ways of understanding and dealing with what's going on? And it's important, number one, to provide sources of information that complement their understandings and that is in an accessible language, and to use a collaborative research approach. So as important as it is for us to bring this understanding of this global change into their world, it's also important for them to inform us about how this global phenomenon is affecting different places. For example, they have this intimate local knowledge. of observing and working within this ecosystem for all their lives. So how can we also benefit from that? So from the beginning of this project, I began to collaborate with and consult with a permafrost scientist at the Permafrost Institute in the capital city, Alexander Fyodorov, who has been working mostly in the central regions where there's another large group of Saha horse and cattle breeders. He had shared with me some of his data, this one showing the increased water on the land between 7 years, and this next one showing how from 1993 to 2008, several small lakes not only expanded and grew into one large lake, but also deepened significantly. So I put the idea out to him of conducting what we call knowledge exchanges. Let's see if we can get these communities together and talk about his research and also what they're observing. So we could bring local and scientific knowledge into conversation. And so here we are figuring out what that will look like in terms of his presentation. We're also joined by Victoria Filipovna from the Institute of Humanitarian Research in Yakutsk. And here we are in 2010 heading out to the villages and the regional centers, and we did eight knowledge exchanges, 4 in the 4 main regional centers of the Vilui regions, and 4 in the villages where I was conducting ongoing research. And the first thing we did was we had people from the audience who wanted to talk about what they'd been observing come up and share that knowledge. So here we have a very avid gardener who is talking about how she's understanding this change. The change here she's talking about, of course, is the changing range of species as these more southern birds are coming up into the north. And for her, she got it because they're ruining her tomato crop. This gentleman is a cowboy, and he traveled 10 kilometers on his horse to come to this knowledge exchange to talk about how he has observed the land changing. And this is critical too because the land there, as you probably saw from some of the earlier photographs, is relatively flat. And so you can only imagine how disrupting and concerning it would be if an area that you'd been walking or riding your horse across for 20 or 30 years suddenly had valleys and hills. And Alexander showed some of his slides. This was his dissertation project to make a map of all the different kinds of permafrost. You probably didn't know there were this many kinds of permafrost. Well, this is just a small part of the Arctic, so just multiply that from all around. It's very diverse. It's not surprising, I guess. But the important part of this slide is to show that these 2 areas where Saha, this is the Vilui regions, and these are the central regions. These 2 areas where Saha have stayed because of these natural hayfields are areas of type of permafrost that is most susceptible to melting. As it warms, it's filled with ice wedges that either come up, you remember probably that ice wedge mountain or hill we saw in a recent slide, and also falls, depending on other conditions underground. So this is critical to understand. And he also showed some pictures that are very familiar to people in the village. Again, a landscape that was before relatively flat, starting to fall and rise and turn into lake. And this one very dramatic valley has been made on a once flat landscape. Here also something people are familiar with seeing is the dropping of the roof, assuming that there's either an ice wedge here that fell under the foundation or one that rose under the foundation on this end. And at the top, he showed the air temperature and how it corroborates with the increasing temperature of the actual permafrost underground. And lastly, he showed this picture, which people are also very familiar with, of the dying forest as the water across the land expands into the forests. So there were a lot of levels of exchange in this knowledge exchange process, and one of them that it makes sense now that I think about it, but I wasn't really anticipating it. I found that these were very cathartic for people. Saha, as people they don't talk about things they're worried about. They tend to hold these in, sort of, keep themselves strong and tough. And I found that this venue where they could talk about this was very supportive for them, very cathartic. And there were a lot of children there, which, we did have to kind of make some effort to make it hopeful. So in follow-up interviews about the process, we asked people what they thought we should do, and most of them wanted us to do knowledge exchanges all across the Republic, which we could not do. Our next idea was to create a website, but the internet service is awful in these remote places, and so we decided to create a handbook. They like these little handbooks, and so we worked over a 3-year period with the communities to put this handbook together. You can see me in the upper right picture with my graduate students as we're compiling it. One of them is a Saha woman, Vera Soloveitova. Very lucky to have her living in Fairfax. In the bottom left, you can see the Ministry of Ecology. Nurguyana Bosalayeva represented here. The Ministry of Ecology agreed to disperse the 3,000 copies of the handbook throughout the Vilui regions, which was also very helpful. And once it was published and out, we went back to the original villages and did a presentation with them. There were a couple other offshoots to this project. Alexander Fyodorov had yet to set up a permafrost station in the Vilui area, and so we combined that with creating a project in the school in Kutana, one of the research villages, and developed a program for the students called What Can the Permafrost Tell Us? So looking at the change in the permafrost and then extrapolating that out into the ecosystem as a whole. And then the culminating project of this and another project which went on at the same time, which I will talk about soon, was creating these interactive atlas programs. I collaborated with Exchange of Local Observations and Knowledge in the Arctic, ILOCA, who do these maps across the Arctic with communities who want to put their toponyms, their place names into a layer, who want to monitor their environment, etc. It's completely up to the communities what their layers have in them. So Kutana, here is the map. They created a timeline across the bottom, and what they want to do here is make a layer that's got settlement over those years. So you can take that timeline right across the bottom and see how, for example, in the Soviet period, they were brought in, collectivized, etc. But an important part of this is the layer for their environmental monitoring, their monitoring of temperature. This is a wonderful way also to engage the young people in the villages who are the computer savvy ones. It gives them something to bring and some interest in this type of a project and gets them interacting with their elders, who often are the sources of a lot of the information that go into here. There can be a layer of cultural heritage, there can be stories and songs, archival documents, you name it. So in amidst all of this research focusing on climate change, I began to notice something else was changing. Cows were disappearing from the landscape in these villages. These same cows that supported my 1999 cows and kin finding. But anyway, I didn't get too attached to that. I decided this is important. What's going on here? And so I started asking people in the process. This is from my monograph about cows are everywhere and everything. Yeah, now it's changing. Those are pictures from then too. So people gave me a few reasons. One of the reasons is that the stores now have everything they need. So this is a quote from one participant sort of talking about how the deficits of certain things have shifted. Back then, you know, the stores were completely deficit in most things. This picture of a 1999 store gives you a sense. I think you can see bottles of oil, several kinds of vodka, tea, salt, vinegar, candy, and cigarettes. So not a very balanced diet, at least not for me. But you can see how they talk about in 2012 how these deficits have now changed. So now the stores are filled, and they're starting to see a deficit of these local products of meat and milk, etc. And just to give you a sense of how powerful this force of globalization is, in 2012 I remember very clearly walking up to the main store and seeing this little blue and yellow sign that said IKEA. And I thought, whoa, okay. So what does that do? That affects their local subsistence economy and their food security. And I ought to mention to you that although many people are getting free of their cow barn, as they put it, modernizing, there are in each of the 4 villages 3 or 4 or 5 households who are not getting rid of their animals. In fact, they're expanding them. And when I talked with them, they said, you know, we could have another big crisis, so we're not bailing out. We get it. You know, maybe the supply trucks to the stores won't show up. Maybe something else will change in our government. Who knows? But in the meantime, they're also providing this local meat and milk to their neighbors who have gotten rid of their animals. So it occurred to me that perhaps this is a natural evolution to a market. But not only are we seeing less of this country food, you could call it, or the food that they raise and harvest and create on their own, but also other areas, foraging, gardening, fishing, and hunting are also on the downside because of this glut in the stores. Another powerful force is the outmigration of young people. So we also asked young people, specifically in this future sustainability project, about if they leave their village, will they come back? And 19 out of 20 of them said that they would if they could get a job back in the village based upon the education they get when they leave. So we understood it's not a matter of young people not being interested in living in their home village. It's more about the lack of jobs. But it is true that many youth are not interested in living the village life as is portrayed in this slide here. They're like young people all around the world. I think they're very mesmerized by electronics and computers. They're listening to a different voice, as they say. And here I bring up again this question in my mind, which I will only know in a process of time, is this maybe the natural evolution to a real market? So perhaps cows and kin was an adaptation as they made it into this more natural productive economy. If you think about it, it does make more sense for 4 or 5 people in the village to keep the animals, supply their neighbors, and have everyone specialized into other areas. So here, seeing this change in the economy, seeing this change in young people, adding into this, looking at the change generated by climate change, I came up with this idea of the complexity of change. So it's not correct in our research to just look at climate change, especially as I'm sure many of you have experienced if you work in climate change. It's not on the forefront of people's minds. As some papers have already mentioned here at this conference, people are trying to live from one day to the next. So issues like the economy and how they're going to feed their family and where are their young people going and how are they going to support them or not are much more. Climate change is definitely there, as you can see from what I've shown you, but it's not as immediate of an effect. So I think of complexity of change as one example of how we can operationalize Kirsten Hastrup's concept of bottom-up complexity. And this, I'm here giving you an example of how these three changes interact amongst themselves, but also how they come in to the local via the specific ecosystem conditions of the local and via the sociocultural, historical, economic, and political context, and then form and interact with perceptions, understandings, and responses, which, as we know, are a foundational cultural aspect in communities. So to give you a sense here of this other project that I said was going on, started a few years after the climate project, looking specifically at changing seasonality, working in a comparative context, looking at Vilui Saha, but also at coastal communities in Labrador, Canada, working with an historical climatologist, and trying to understand, for example, what are the differences, what are the similarities, how are these very different places and these very different cultures adapting to this change, how do they talk about it, perceive it, understand it. And what we found was that similar issues with their foundation, the foundation of their ice, of their lives. So we can think of sea ice as being very central to the subsistence livelihoods of these coastal communities. As you can see here, this is one of our main villages, Makovic. You can see how the village is basically, built around the water here, set up to work on the water. The importance of ice for transportation, but more importantly, the importance of ice for seal hunting, for fishing, and etc. And also these communities where we work are very historically rich communities with a lot of older people, with very in-depth stories of their ancestors and their adaptation to this extreme environment. We use similar methodologies, focus groups, and one-on-one interviews. And we found very similar narratives, especially about the winter season in Makovic, the old-fashioned cold, as they called it, and in Saha, the bull of winter not arriving, etc. Similar dependence on ice, but in different forms. So we can think of Vilui Saha as being dependent on permafrost being there, and the Labrador communities being dependent on the sea ice. So why is this important? Well, if we think about it, in 2007, we know that we went from a majority rural world to an urban world. Our population numbers changed at that point in time. And people argue that we do need to urbanize, that we need to conserve our energy and preserve lands, etc. But as Carol Crumley argues, these rural populations, they are complex adaptive systems, and they are also bioculturally diverse, linguistically diverse, and humans can, and history shows that humans are stewards of the environment. We do have that potential to actually be a positive force in nature because we are of nature. So I began to look at how the complexity of change in these rural areas, in these other projects that I was working on, either played out or didn't. I worked on a project on the Chesapeake Bay, so this really brings the research home. This is the Eastern Shore. This red area shows Dorchester County, which is projected to experience the greatest amount of sea level rise and which is experiencing it right now. The watermen, as they're called, that is the term used for crabbers and oysterers. They talked about the changes in sea level. They talked about how it was impacting their economy. But they also talked about their young people not being interested in continuing the waterman tradition, going off to the cities and other places. And they also talked about how difficult it was in the present economic system to continue. And then I did travel to Kiribati, which is in the South Pacific, an atoll of 33 islands, and to Highland, Peru, for a documentary, which actually is going to be shown tomorrow at 9 o'clock, just in case you want to know. And in Kiribati, even though I was only there for 10 days and I wouldn't really call it research, my observations and interactions with people there, of course, it's very concerning the amount of sea level rise that's going on. Some of you may know that they have already bought land on Fiji and are trying to relocate with dignity instead of leaving the islands piecemeal to try to conserve some of their cultural identity, their language, etc., by moving as a large group. But long story short, they have a very rich tradition, rich culture, expressive culture. They're very wedded to their land. It's very sad what's going on with sea level rise. But again, these similar drivers of the complexity of change are present with the young people, etc. And then Highland, Peru, where we also went to capture the issue of unprecedented glacial melt in the Andes, a place very dependent upon that glacial water for all of their agricultural purposes. And as you know, this is one of the agriculturally biodiverse areas of the world where lots of the origins of many of the food crops that we depend on are found. And there's a lot of concern because this is has something, well, it's termed verticality. Basically, a farmer can have fields between 7,000 and 13,000 feet. And in each of those altitudes, a different crop is grown. But now they're moving up in altitude as the temperature warms. So this is concerning because it doesn't go up forever. We got to visit some of the glaciers, etc. But the similar drivers here, a lot of young people going to Lima, getting out of these rural areas, and issues with ecology. I don't know if any of you know Patricia Hammer, who is a medical anthropologist, has a center down there, and we were able to stay with them. And then I've done some research in Wales. So Wales, of course, is a highly agricultural country, having terrible issues with precipitation due to climate change, and also issues of young people leaving the farming and economic issues also at work. Culturally rich, beautiful land. So I'm going to end with, almost there, this new project in Mongolia. I was invited to collaborate on a largely natural science project there, looking at how fish species in Lake Hovskal and in tributaries were changing, the populations were changing as a result of climate change. And one summer during field work, they noticed that herders were fishing a lot. So they thought, well, maybe we need a social scientist to help us understand these humans. And so I agreed right away because I'd been to Mongolia in 1990 and I loved Mongolia. And so I went, and this gives you a sense of the diversity of ecosystems in Mongolia. Anything from complete desert to high mountain ecosystems. And here is the approximate location of the capital city of Ulaanbaatar. And then these two red X's are where we were working up in the taiga forest. This is a close-up of our area. We visited two communities at the confluence of the Egg and the Ore rivers and at the confluence of the Egg and the Salangay. So this is one of my two little video clips. And so imagine you're out walking very early in the morning and suddenly you hear these bells ringing. I think I can hear them. Where's our bell? I had these graduate students who were going to do this for me. Is he not here? He's not here? Oh, okay. Well, so it's not yet. No, they still have a chance to redeem themselves. You hear these little tinkles of bells, and you also hear these little bleats of lambs. Oh, there's the bell. Thank you. Okay. Oops. What happened? I didn't want that to happen. I want to show this. Okay, so, imagine we're going to hear these sound effects once again. What? It worked before. Okay, come on. Don't fail me now. Thank you. Now, see, isn't this great? Imagine, there I was walking along on this ridge, and I look over, and here's these little white dots coming right through that low pass there. I stopped and I listened. I could hear it well when I was videoing it, and it didn't come out very well. So I show this to you just to give you a sense of what the people we worked with do in the summer. This is a large part of their summer activity. So they move in the summer to summer pastures. So they're semi-nomadic. The other big job in the summer is because they live too far from markets to be able to take their fresh milk to the market on a daily basis, they need to do something with all the milk. So that takes a lot of time. They make these milk chips, they're called. There's all kinds of improvisations on this basic theme. As you can imagine, everybody tries to think. Here you see the curds with the whey draining out of them, preparing to press it into a block and then carving out these chips. Here you see the girl on the left is getting a little more creative, twisting them into interesting shapes. And another important product that they make in the summer is milk vodka, which is shown here in the middle. So how does the complexity of change pan out or not here in the Mongolian context? So this is a string of sheep ears, little pieces of sheep ears. This is a way of counting how many sheep were killed in the Zud. So Zuds are a phenomena, it's like our 100-year floods in the United States. They're happening like every other year now. Zuds usually happen every 50 to 100 years. There are these extreme weather conditions in the winter where either it's really cold and there's no snow, so everything on the land completely freezes and nothing grows in the spring, or it snows so deeply that the animals, which in the winter time they dig down to the fodder that's on the ground and eat it, it's so deep they can't reach it. And there's, for example, in 2010, I think something like 6 million animals died in Mongolia. Put out all of the herders who were just on the brink economically of making it. They went out of business totally. So it's a critical and important aspect of how climate change is affecting this ecosystem. So climate change and the things that people told us also about the changes in the winter temperatures, in the summer temperatures, et cetera, also are clear. The economy, one of the clearest signs, I think, of the economic pressures for herders is the fact that they are keeping more sheep to sell to the Kashmir market, so this is a very lucrative market. And so by changing the makeup of their herd, they're not only changing the amount of meat and milk they have for their subsistence, but as you know, goats are more destructive to the environment than other herding animals. And even though you've seen some pictures of young people so far, there is a tendency for young people to do what this young lady is doing. She's in the summer yurt, or ger, as they call them there. So there is this understanding that young people are moving away from this lifestyle. They're going to Ulaanbaatar, they're staying there, they're living as they can, listening to another world. This is their winter home, so they move between at least 2 places. Some people have more. And so the winter home is a place that has not been grazed in the summertime, so animals can continue to graze in the winter there, and they can also put up some hay for the animals that can't go out and graze. So I want to just introduce you quickly to 2 households, one in each of these sites. This woman has come to this area for summer grazing and camp since she was 5 years old. She now lives there with her husband and 3 children. 2 of her children have part-time work, but most of what they do is generated by their animals. So even though I said they don't take goods to the market daily, they do make most of their income from selling their meat at certain times of the year, bringing it in. And when we asked her about changes in the temperatures, changes she's observed, she did talk about how the summers are cooler. So they're ready and used to having a very warm and dry summer. And she referenced an ancestral understanding, kind of predicting what would be happening, perhaps potentially relevant to right now, is that they would, I'm sure you've seen the Mongolian vests with the thick fur on the inside, that they would need to wear those vests in the summertime. She also talked about other changes and observations, and she was very knowledgeable about climate change. She understood that this was climate change at work, and so did the other people in this first site. And then a household from the second site, we spoke with this older woman and her 4 grandchildren. She's here with her son and her son's wife and children. And she also has been coming to this specific area since she was a child. And she referred to the cooling of the summer also, but she gave a very different explanatory story. She talked about how, well, this is an area that is destined to become a flooded reservoir for a huge hydro dam. And it's been off and on for 20 years, this project. Lately it's been on. And so she complained about how the government had had these meetings at the beginning of this process, telling them that they would help them to find comparable lands to relocate to. In the last few years, that conversation has stopped, and they're no longer assuring them of that. And they've also sent fleets of archaeologists and their laborers out into this valley to dig up all of the remaining artifacts before the area's flooded. And so their understanding is that all the digging in the earth is what's causing the changes. None of the people in this area that we interviewed talked about climate change. They talked about how it was because of all the activity that's going on. And as you can see from this quote here, there is this sort of acceptance of what's going on because it's progress, and maybe we need to do this. At the same time, you can tell their hearts are breaking. So we saw this coming in. I took a picture of it because I thought, wow, that's a pretty big encampment. It turns out this is where all the archaeologists and their laborers are living for the summer. As you can see them here, busy trying to find all the artifacts. A very rich area for these artifacts. So here's my second little video. This is going to give you a sense from the top of the ridge of the area that this dam is going to flood. Sorry you can't see it. I think you get a sense. It's a big. I didn't move my feet. That was a few years ago. I was younger then. All right. This shows where we were camped. You see those little white specks near the river. We were camped there. And I just wanted to show you that and tell you that I like to walk in the early morning. And just, a 2-minute walk from our campsite, this is before me. It's got like runic inscriptions on it and things. And I'm thinking, wow, it's just out here all by itself, it's not protected. That's pretty amazing. And then there were a lot of these sacred places called ovals, they're at high passes between the mountains. They're often at springs. It's a place where the people believe there's a spirit living, and so they give gifts to it and recognize it with blue streamers. So sacred sites, sacred areas. So the director of this big hydro dam project came through the last day I was there. And he invited us to this party he wanted to have. And he had gotten a master's in Denver, spoke English fairly fluently, and was very gung-ho about this project because, as the older woman talked about, his idea was that this was progress. And I had the opportunity earlier that day to just talk to him a little bit. I told him that I'd spoken with a lot of people there and that they were fairly heartbroken about their lands that they'd been working on all their lives, going underwater, and they didn't know where they would go. And this was his comment. And this comment stayed with me, kind of eerie. They can just move, right? It may appear that the herders can just move, considering the vastness of Mongolia and the appearance of plenty of open space to move to. However, the fact is that not only have the herders been using the lands in question on their annual rounds for many years, if not generations, most other land in the area is either unsuitable, taken by other herders, or being used for agriculture. This stayed with me until I finally decided that I wanted to work on this, that this is, anthropologists and other social scientists have worked on big dam projects for decades. We know a lot about this. But how do we think about this in terms of place attachment? So we're talking about transhumans. So transhumans being people who move from place to place. And even though there's not a fence around their quote-unquote property, they still understand that these are the landscapes that they use. So this project and this visual here is the projected flooded area. Pantea is going to be flooded, as you can see the triangles in the water. And there are 700 families who are going to be displaced for their summer and some people winter homes. So this new project, which I just submitted to NSF on Friday, Maverick, I've never been able to think of acronyms, and I got this one. Wow. Making a verifiable record, pastoralism, big dams, and climate change in Mongolia. So here's this idea that since they don't have leases to this land, they don't have fences around it, but yet they do use it, they need it, how can we work with them to somehow document that land use? So this is what this project is about. Using qualitative and quantitative methods. I'm working with an ecologist, actually one of the people on that natural science project, who has a lot of experience with mapping techniques. So going out and putting people's landscapes that they use onto GIS, but also using fuzzy cognitive mapping, which is a technique of getting people to talk about what they see on their land and how they see it, right? So I wrote these beginnings and endings down because I wanted to make sure I said what I wanted to say. All these projects that I've shared with you today are woven through with bottom-up complexity, both anthropological and scientific, which, when considered holistically, make clear the adaptive challenges therein. This understanding in turn has impassioned me to pursue transformative interdisciplinarity. In other words, doing effective interdisciplinary work. So briefly, I'll go back to the main points, which I think you remember, maybe a little bit. But I'll reiterate them here to just bring us back to them. And most importantly, anthropology contributes important insights and tools to discern bottom-up complexities and adaptive challenges, and can make important contributions towards transformative interdisciplinary global change projects. I also want to mention that when I first sent Linda my title, she was concerned about the term bottom-up complexity, because it would have, this is cultural information I'm giving you. She said it would have strange implications in Australia, and I totally get it. But Kirsten Hastrup uses it. Of course, she's over in Denmark, and Roger Pilkey in the United States uses it for his term. But anyway, that's the term we use. So if I've offended anybody, please forgive me. I didn't mean to. All right. So thank you very much. Here are some yaks. If you've never seen yaks, I got to see them for the first time. And Bayarla is thank you in Mongolian. And if we have time, I'd be happy to entertain some questions.
Are there any questions or comments? I think there was one up there. Yes.
Here comes a microphone. Oh, you have a good voice?
Yeah, I have a really loud voice. I really appreciate your work. I've written about it since on online writing and stuff. But one of the questions I want to ask you is that how do we make sure that this narrative doesn't fall into the same framework as the disappearing native and the tragic disappearance of diversity narrative, where these are the last generations who will live like this because they're inevitably going to die out in the face of progress? We've seen this narrative for so long. I mean, we still see picture books, coming out where people take photographs and say, these are the last people who will live like this. Instead of, these are people who've been crowded into the marginal spaces around capitalism. And now the damage that capitalism has done is starting to crush those spaces. And we want the resources under them that we didn't think we wanted. And I mean, in this area, isn't it natural gas that's also with the Sakha and there's now drilling going on there, isn't there as well? I mean, I'm just worried that there's a danger if we tell the story of their adaptation and their way of life without that powerful narrative that these are people who've been pushed to the margins by the system that's caused this.
Right.
And I'm just concerned about that.
Certainly. And if I implied, I certainly didn't say these are the last people. So if I implied that, I certainly didn't mean that. I was really just trying to show how my work in anthropology as an applied anthropologist is one way of bringing to light what's going on, and also empowering people to have, for example, in the dam project, giving them some capacity to talk about, yes, we use these lands, we've used these lands for many generations in the process of negotiations with this inevitable project that's going to happen. Instead of just saying, oh, I guess it's progress and we'll just have to figure out where we're going. So my intention is not to say these are the last people. And I hope that it's clear, too, which it might not be, that the process you're talking about is definitely going on, that they are marginalized, that they are pushed to the margins, even by people who call themselves Mongolian. This director man who, I was curious about his attitude. I asked him in that afternoon meeting, it was just kind of, because his attitude was very different. I asked him where he grew up. He grew up in the capital city. His parents were school teachers. So I wanted to get a sense of his understanding of how these people live in this rural area, these rural areas. And then I asked him where his ancestors were from, and he changed the subject. But, to be honest with you, if I gave that impression that that's what I was trying to present to you here, I certainly didn't intend to.
I think just that some of the symbols are so similar. I mean, I don't think you're trying to do that, but for example, the next generation is interested in mobile phones. I mean, this is a really powerful, popular, myth out there about that assimilation is happening mostly because the kids want what we have, instead of the assimilation is happening because there are no, which you also brought up, there are no jobs. It's very difficult to envision a future when your fields are getting waterlogged. And I'm just, it's not an indictment of what you're saying, it's a fear. Having had my own narratives co-opted into these kinds of, these sort of images, yeah.
And we also need to appreciate like the work of Rasmussen in Greenland, where he talks about how, cultures are not dying because young people are moving to the cities. They're evolving as cultures always have. And if young people are going to be in the cities, that doesn't mean that things are over, right? They're taking up what they're taking up, and that's important to understand. And maybe there is this attraction to electronics and computers. It is happening. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, this culture is no longer going to go on. It's going on. I mean, we can look at Alaskan Native organizations too, and the kinds of developments and evolutions of culture that's going on with technology. This idea that they can't be who they are culturally if they're not still riding dog sleds. If they get on a skidoo, they're suddenly, not allowed to do that. It's ridiculous, right? So I agree with you. Yes, Hans, please. I just met my buddy Hans.
Yeah. Climate justice activists argue not climate change, system change. And I've been arguing for some time now that the elephant in the room when it comes to climate change is global capitalism. Fortunately, 2 years ago, Naomi Klein wrote a much more popular book making the same type of argument. So what are your thoughts as to what anthropologists can do to think about system change, not just at the local level, but at the global level, and to think of moving to some alternative world system? Any thoughts on that?
Certainly. The CEO of Exxon has now been nominated by our president-elect to be the Secretary of State in the United States. And so, and I heard him on Democracy Now! This morning talking about how climate change is just an engineering problem, right? When in fact, I think anthropologists do incredibly powerful work communicating the level at which we need to transform our culture. A lot of people don't get it because they just don't understand, number one, why do we need anthropologists? Why do we need to study ourselves? Once we get them over that misconception and they start to say, oh yeah, maybe we are the problem and we are the solution, they can gain a greater appreciation for what really needs to change is how we culturally interact. So I'm with you all the way. And there are anthropologists working in policy, working in consumption studies, working on these issues that you're talking about.
Got another question up back there.
Okay. This microphone is moving around.
Look, what I was kind of interested in was two kind of different parallel narratives going on at the same time. So one was the generational issue, which was sort of a classic kind of modernist value issue, as Greg's talking about. But the other was a kind of an interesting kind of thing of almost, in a sense, the transformation of these people into citizen scientists, precisely because of, in effect, this kind of, it wasn't that the value change was happening at the same time as certain other things were remaining at a level constant. It was actually that literally the physical environment and a whole series of basically very empirically observable and documentable changes were happening, and a certain kind of transformation of attitude. And in a funny kind of way, what it seemed to me was that both in one sense the value systems, but at another more fundamental level, the kind of, almost, if you like, sort of systems of explanation of ontological systems are up for grabs. Like, how do you actually explain the very nature of the world? So both of these kind of things are happening and moving at the same time. And it struck me that part of the interest of what you're talking about was actually, and which is unusual, is those two kinds of things both, in a sense, moving up against each other as a kind of both a social and ecological process. And I wonder if you had any kind of thoughts about whether, in a sense, that modernist dynamic had a specific force in
Repeat that very last sentence.
that whether that very classically modernist dynamic actually has a kind of a different twist precisely because of that kind of those very empirical changes.
Is the modernist... I didn't capture that. I'm sorry.
In a sense...
You have a lovely accent, but I'm sorry.
No. That modernist...
I'm trying to adapt.
That kind of classic generational problem, which is, in one sense, it's not just that people... I can imagine young people more or less saying, right, it's not just that we have different values, but actually it's not clear that your values even explain the world anymore, because the world's changing.
I see. So saying that to their elders.
Absolutely.
Their
I can see that as a kind of literally a kind of thing of saying, actually, it's not even clear that the geography's stable, it's not clear that anything else is stable.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting point. I appreciate that very much, Neil. I think that that's very insightful because, as Bill McKibben is known for saying, we're seeing change at a scale we've not seen before, but also with a rapidity we've not seen before. So it does make sense that there would be so much difference between these two generations where young people would start, to just be sort of disoriented by the whole way that their parents and grandparents understand the world because of many, many issues, one of them being also mass media and mass communication. Any graduate students have questions? Come on, graduate students. I love graduate students. Somebody want to know how I got them to bad? No bribing.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was wondering, with reference specifically to the Mongolian material, do you see the recent election in Mongolia as sort of changing the possibility of this STAM project?
Yes.
Mongolia is sort of very politically volatile, and the herding lobby is quite powerful politically. So
yeah, I completely get that. I think the concern I have is that NSF doesn't know if it's going to be funded because our incoming administration doesn't believe in science. So there's a lot of ifs, but I decided, I'm going to do this anyway, whether I get funded or not. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I think it's important. But you're exactly right. Mongolia, is very politically volatile. I think the newest president is a wrestler. Is that true? Do you know anything about this? Anyway, so whatever's happening across this world, it's pretty crazy, isn't it? We've got reality TV stars and wrestlers, but certainly that's part of the context that I'm proposing this research into. And certainly it definitely has some local implications as far as what's going on at the local level and what people are going through. Just the fact that this dam has been in the works for 20 years off and on is, I think, emblematic in itself. Mongolia is in pretty dire straits economically. And the other interesting part of this is that it's literally between Russia and China. And so thinking of it that way geopolitically is also very fascinating. They want their freedom from Russia. That's one of the reasons they justify this hydro dam, because they depend on Russia for energy. Russia can play that card if they want to. So there are a lot of entanglements here. I just want to go do an anthropology project. But I'll look at all that other stuff while I'm doing it.
Yeah, one more question.
And then it's time for drinks.
Yes. Neil has an announcement.
Okay.
Thank you for an absolutely wonderful
Are you a
paper.
graduate student?
No, unfortunately
okay.
not. I
Just
wish I
curious.
was, but I can pretend that I am.
All right. We all once were.
That's right.
Yes.
Look, I wanted to just actually pick up on something that you said in response to Hans's question, where you said that anthropologists are doing powerful work about how we need to transform our culture. And I found that statement very, very powerful in terms of how we think about our enterprise as anthropologists. And here in Australia, we've had a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion about public anthropology. That caused quite a lot of discussion in last year AAS. I was just wondering if you could draw a little bit more about what you mean or what you're thinking about in terms of that statement and how you see anthropology playing a role in addressing what is the key challenge for humanity.
Sure. Well, first of all, the AAA created a task force on climate change, of which I was one of 10 anthropologists, really representing a lot of the different fields of anthropology and the subfields. And we put together a document that you can easily find online, the AAA Task Force on Climate Change Task Force, whatever, document. It'll come up. But anyway, we have a kind of general statement about human rights and et cetera, and then we've got several sections looking at in-depth these issues and the part that anthropology plays, the many parts. And that has been circulated. The problem is also on the receiving end, right? So we as anthropologists can do a lot of important work, but it doesn't get us anywhere if where we're putting that work out to is not received. Oh, and in my mind, one of the main problems of that non-reception is lack of an understanding of what we do as anthropologists. That's one of the reasons I'm excited about the documentary that I'm in. That's one of the reasons why I agreed to do the documentary. At first I was like, I don't want cameras coming to my field site and messing up my research. But then I realized, this could be a powerful way to educate a broader public about what we do as anthropologists. So I think that if people are given the benefit of the doubt and they are brought into an understanding of what anthropologists do, there will be a greater reception of these other important pieces that we play. There are anthropologists working in the public and the private sector outside of academia increasingly. I think that this work is, I'm an optimist, so I do think that our work will be increasingly recognized and accepted, especially as things get worse and worse. I think people are looking, especially in the United States, we've been really galvanized in terms of our concerns and our interests by this recent election. And I think, a lot of my friends wanted to flee the country, and I was joking about getting a job here, but I will consider it, I think. But I think this is the time you need to stay there and work for these. I mean, I've sat up and paid attention since this has happened, and a lot of my friends have too. So I think that as depressing as it is, I think it also can be a force for getting us activated. And I think within the anthropology community, that will also be true. I went to the AAA's, it was just a couple of weeks after the election, and we had a lot of discussion, and there was the keynote, the big keynote talked about it. So I think there's a lot of good work we can continue to do and take up. And
Thanks.